Hi, and welcome to Bristol Festival of Ideas Online. This event is part of a series of conversations with writers and thinkers from all over the world. You can watch more from this series on Bristol Ideas YouTube channel and head to bristolideas.co.uk for even more video, audio, and essays. So I'm briefly going to introduce Gaia and myself. My name's Alex Dietzel, and I'm a senior lecturer in climate ethics and policy at the University of Bristol. I also work with the Cabot Institute for Environmental Change. I'm the Associate Director for Impacts and Innovation, and I sit on the Bristol Advisory Committee on Climate Change. Gaia Vince is with us today, and I'm very excited to speak with her. She's an environmental journalist, broadcaster, and author. She has degrees in chemistry and engineering, as well as in journalism, so a fascinating background, and you can tell from reading the book, your science knowledge for sure. She writes for The Guardian, has a column called Smart Planet for BBC Online, and has been the editor of the journal Nature Climate Change, the news editor of Nature, and an online editor of New Scientist. And she presents science documentaries and on radio and television. So very impressively, her first book, Adventures in the Anthropocene, A Journey to the Heart of the Planet We Made, won the 2015 Royal Society Winton Prize for Science Books, which was actually the first time a woman won the prize outright, which is really cool. Gaia writes a blog, if you want to follow her, wanderinggaia.com, and she's on Twitter as well. Just followed her myself at wanderinggaia. Today, we're going to be talking about her new book, Nomad Century, How to Survive the Climate Upheaval. There's links below this video to buy it from our partners at Waterstones, but it will be available at all good bookshops. I just finished reading the book last night. I was traveling, which seems fitting for the topic of the book, back from Austria, which is where I'm from. And I just really enjoyed it. It was so packed with exciting and creative ideas and discussion points that I'd kind of seen here and there, but I hadn't seen woven together in such a fascinating way. And I immediately thought, my students are really going to love this book. And I'll be popping it on my reading list for them because so many of them are really excited and scared of that intersection of climate change and migration, and really interested in refugees and how to treat them, for example. So I think it's going to be a fascinating book for my undergraduates.
Oh, I hope so.
Much.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, first of all, what was your inspiration for writing this book? It's your third book, right? So what inspired you to write about this topic?
Well, it's actually been something that's preoccupied me for in one way or another for all of my life. So I am the result of migrations. We all are, but I'm more obviously the result of migrations because my father and my grandfather were both refugees in the 50s and moved around. And as a result, I have dual nationality. Well, I probably have more than two nationalities, but Australia and Britain, but other nationalities too, if I sought them. And I think that just it gives you a kind of an idea of being a bit of an outsider sometimes, but also you get this different perspective in that you realize that other nationalities are also valid and other patriotisms are valid and also ridiculous. There isn't, there isn't this amazing, unique character that is British or Austrian or from anywhere else. We're all just humans, and by accident of birth, we end up in a particular land. And either we have these amazing passport privileges where we can move around wherever we want. Britain's obviously given up that recently, but we still are, very privileged in comparison to someone moving from Yemen, say. So that idea of where do you belong, I think, has always been with me. But I went on a journey for 2.5 years mainly around the global South to research my first book, and I was really going to a lot of the places that hit particularly acutely with climate change, and looking at how people there are responding and what they're doing about it and how they're getting on with their lives. And it became clear to me, you know, a decade ago, I guess, that people are already moving or will have to move. And there's this great conversation which is not happening at all about, you know, what do we do about places that cannot adapt? You know, I mean, it's when I started my career in writing, I spent perhaps the first decade with the narrative being, oh, we've got to get people to talk about the idea that we need to mitigate for so that climate change doesn't happen. We need to stop our cut our carbon emissions so that we don't get any climate change, you know, and we weren't allowed to talk about adaptation, really. The idea that climate change was going to happen already is happening and we need to adapt to it. It was kind of like, no, we mustn't even let it happen. And then, you know, now slowly we are starting to talk about adaptation. I mean, you know, that's still a long way behind mitigation. If you look at funds for international funds for helping people adapt to climate change, for example. But the idea that there are places that cannot adapt, you know, people, enormous numbers of people living in places that will not be able to adapt. Well, that is not being talked about. And that's, it's, you know, it's really quite urgent to talk about that, because what are we going to do about that? At the moment, we're just moving from one crisis to another, just sort of chaotically. And it's not working. It's becoming a catastrophe. We can do a lot better than that. You know, we can plan for this, we can manage it, we can make it work, but only if we actually do those things. We need to actually start talking about it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've been studying climate policy mainly at the global scale since 2011, which is when I started my PhD, so about 10 years. And I agree with you, you know, often in the literature in climate justice, adaptation's referred to as the kind of poor cousin of mitigation because of funding, but also policy discussions. And of course, at the global stage, the Global South is pushing for open discussions about adaptation, funding it, what it will look like, detailed plans. And they just keep pushing and pushing, but the global north is resisting.
I mean, people are now starting, you know, there is this, you know, big campaign to talk about loss and damages, for example, which is, you know, when you can't adapt to a certain extent, it's what's already happened. But that's a conversation they're trying to have, you know, we're not getting anywhere with that. But to acknowledge that some places you cannot adapt. You know, we're really lucky in the some of the northern latitude places like London, for example. We can do a lot with adaptation because, you know, we will of course have extreme weather events. Nowhere will be untouched by climate change. We will all have to adapt, but we have much more capacity to adapt for a variety of reasons in places like London than people have in, you know, the south of Bangladesh, for example.
Exactly. And like you said right at the beginning, that's just an accident of birth and pure luck of geography. And one of the cruelest things about climate change, that the places that are causing the greatest emissions are also the safest from the effects, which is why I became a climate justice scholar, because that's such a fascinating and
yeah, exactly. And so that of course then imbues you with, if you happen to live in one of those places by accident of birth, imbues you with a certain responsibility, I would say, over, you know, the accident of your birth. Your ancestors were largely responsible for your comfort, but also the discomfort of people in tropical countries, which are much more heavily affected. So, exactly. You know, that yeah.
Well, of course, it seems very obvious to me, of course, as a justice scholar and also an Austrian that went to an American school and lives in the UK. So, you know, similar background to yourself, a migrant, and someone who was kind of educated as an international citizen from the outset at this American international school.
And I think that's something that's giving me a lot of hope, because there is a whole generation, especially in Europe, but there is a whole generation of younger people who have been brought up in this the EU, and who think much more globally, much more internationally, and then they don't feel as restricted by all sorts of definitions that previous generations have been.
Definitely. So obviously you and I are in agreement, but who ideally do you want to read this book, or who is this book for?
Well, it's for all of us, because you know, even if we know a lot of these things, we perhaps don't have the facts to hand. We don't have the data, which is what I try to collate there to strengthen arguments when discussing with other people. But it's also really for policymakers. I really would like people who you know, who are involved in actually making decisions about these incredibly important issues, to, well, to have the facts at hand, but also to think beyond that, to really think about what the world will be like. You know, we have to imagine, and it is a feat of imagination, because none of us knows exactly, you know, what our world will be like in a few decades, and it will be a very different world. The climate will be different, the geography will be different, the demography will be different, everything will be different. How we eat, how we power our homes, how we cook, how we get from A to B, everything. This is an enormous upheaval, an enormous transition that we're all undertaking. And because we're in the middle of it, it's quite hard to see, actually. It's quite hard to get that perspective and take a look back and look at it over the scope of a century. But yeah, I hope that we try and engage in that, because it's not just for policymakers, it is also very much for all of us, because this is a conversation I want to start. You know, it is a manifesto that I'm laying out here of what I think we should do, what I think the solution should be. But I don't have all the answers, and I totally accept that many of these will be uncomfortable or unpalatable, or people will outright disagree with many of my solutions. That's fine. Let's just talk about it. Let's have a conversation, because at the moment, no one is talking about these issues. And that's much more troubling to me.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's such a valuable resource because of the way that you've laid out the facts and figures and presented the information in such an accessible manner. So I find it quite a breadth of information, but you also really dig down into the details. And some of the pages where you've drawn out maps of what the world might look like, or which regions will be affected in which way, I find really helpful as a resource to talk about it with my students and colleagues, you know, and policymakers as well, because it's a snapshot.
Great.
Yeah,
because your students are the people that are going to be, you know, setting the agenda for us all in the next decade or so. And, you know, I really hope that they do take on board some of these, because it's not just about the science, it's also about the humanity, about the social, political situation that we're in and how we navigate that. And you know, the physics will still be the physics, but exactly. how we navigate that really depends on us.
Yeah, and my students are, you know, they're politics students, but they're also in economics, philosophy, they do sociology, so a real mixed bag of people who really understand social change and want to influence.
Great.
So I'm definitely putting it on my list, so they'll be reading it, and I'm sure they will really enjoy it. I wanted to dig down into a few questions that interested me as a kind of policy and climate ethics person. The first thing is, I really loved the way that you spoke about migration, you know, both looking back and forwards, that we are historically a species that have migrated and it made our world. And also about the present benefits of migration and the future benefits of migration, especially in the context of a 3 or 4 degree world, which we are still heading towards. So I wanted to ask you, obviously I agree with everything you said about the benefits of migration, but we're in this context of rising nationalism and outright racism against migrants. And so I'm wondering how we might change that narrative quickly enough, and whether you had any ideas on that that you could share with people who are interested in reading the book.
Yeah, so the narrative around migration has become really quite toxic, especially in this country and in the United States. We've seen this rise in nationalism. We've seen this demonization of people, especially people with darker skin. So I think it's really worrying, and yeah, it makes me panic. And that's one of the reasons, again, that I wanted to write this book. But at the same time, that actually masks a much more tolerant and generous opinion among the general public. If you poll people in the public, especially in cities and especially in places where people live alongside or actually meet migrants regularly, people have a much more positive attitude towards them. In fact, they would like to see quite often more migration, because basically it's an economic benefit to the host nation to get as many migrants in as possible to do labor, to look after children, to do your teeth. We don't have enough dentists, we don't have enough doctors, we don't have enough people to work on the farms, to do care work, to basically run our economy. They also make obviously a huge cultural and social contribution to the country, and the most vibrant cities, the most lively cities are generally the ones that have the largest migrant populations, because you get that breadth of different food restaurants, different types of music, and all sorts of other cultural richness. So there's that. We're also facing in the wealthier northern countries especially, but in large areas of the world, a massive demographic time bomb where we're just not having enough babies to provide the workforce to look after an aging population, which is a huge problem that hasn't been solved by any country yet. There are all sorts of strategies planned for this, like a robot workforce and things like that. It's much easier, cheaper, and makes a lot more sense in every way to have greater immigration. So there's that. So although on the face of it, if you look at some of the tabloid headlines, if you look at some of the rhetoric coming from nationalist populist leaders and governments, you look at things like the UK's Rwanda policy, which is completely insane, you might get the impression that we are vehemently anti-migration. But then if you look at actually polls of the public, that's not true. People are much more positive. And so when the Russian invasion of Ukraine occurred, the EU within a week had immediately transformed its migration policy. So it's taken away that ring-fenced, protected border around the EU, very generously said that anyone from Ukraine, and that included Africans that had been studying there, and other migrant workers, anybody from Ukraine was allowed to come into the EU, work anywhere, was to be given help with that for 2 years, and basically treated as an EU citizen. Yeah. And within a week, 1 million refugees across the border. That is something that I wouldn't have believed before that. Yeah. And it was a transformation that occurred very, very quickly, a social transformation that occurred very quickly. And on top of that, what I found really remarkable and really heartwarming is the number of people that, without being asked by the government, without being told to do anything, banded together as a community, networked, found people homes, found people clothes, and even in the countries that were particularly hostile to migrants, if you look at places like Hungary and Poland, which are, extremely hostile to migrants. I mean, it helped that the migrants were white, Christian largely, but nevertheless, these were poor people from Eastern Europe, which have traditionally been demonized by the West, and they were welcomed, even in countries that made it as hard as possible, like Britain, to accept any migrants. The actual population volunteered in huge numbers. And I think that shows that we are much more open than our governments give us credit for.
Yes, yeah, I found that fascinating as well, and we talked about it, a lot in my classroom. The rapid shift in policy. This leads me really nicely onto my next question, actually, which is, you're suggesting a huge transformation in how we view and organize migration in response to climate change. And right now, the way that it works is that we do have, the UNHCR, which regulates migration. We have the IMO. But we don't really have a system in place where countries all follow the same rules. It's really that countries kind of sign up to the global agreement and then they do whatever they want within a few boundaries of human rights protection. So I'm wondering how you envision global migration governance in the future, especially in terms of overcoming these power politics and dynamics between countries. So, for example, do we need a new international body, or could we kind of enhance what we already have, or how do you picture this kind of global governance of migration?
Well, I mean, it could go in any way. I think personally that we need a new international body that is, something like the IMO by name, but is actually it has actual powers to manage this, because individual countries can maintain border controls and sovereignty and all that sort of thing to a certain extent. But now that we are facing what is a planetary crisis, this is not something that individual countries can manage on their own and influence on their own. It's just not going to work. And that applies also to the climate crisis. We need an international body with teeth that really can organize this in a fair, logistical manner and timely manner, because this is something that you can't just sit on for decades, making incremental changes. And we have never managed to achieve anything on this scale before, but we've never faced anything on this scale before. I mean, the closest I can think of is probably the post-war refugee situation, where that was managed fairly quickly and timely, but it was much smaller and it was much more localized, really. So what I see basically is that this becomes it becomes a labor and humanitarian issue. So it's about jobs and about obviously humanitarian crises. So countries and this body needs proper funding from the member nations. I mean, the UN is the only body that I can see that could do this. And yes, it's been, it's had problems and it's been rightly criticized for all sorts of unfortunate issues. But this is the only way I see that we have as a sort of a structure already in place that could step up to this challenge. And the member countries pay for this body, give it funding, and also have a say in how it is run. But a leader is elected to this body that basically allocates people who need to move to places that can accept them and places that are safe, but also can provide jobs. And those places then get financial assistance in moving those people and relocating them and assimilating them into new places. So I mean, this is something that will go on for all of this century. If we manage it well, it could lead to great wealth for accepting countries. So it's all about the management.
Definitely. And it is something that political theorists like myself have been kind of playing with for a long time, especially in terms of those that study climate change, refugees, global health, issues, things like that. What would the body look like? How would it be funded? What would the decision-making procedure look like? So there are loads of scholars who have been
and this is something we need to discuss, exactly, because this level of expertise that you could bring to this you know, it needs to be actually acted upon rather than, you know,
just discussed in academic journals. Yes.
Well, basically, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, because, you know, this is not just an academic subject. This is a practical reality now.
Exactly.
And, you know, we need to act on some of these ideas. You know, the first few, they might not work everywhere, but until we actually try these things, we won't know.
I agree. And it's, you know, the people like myself, applied political theorists, feel exactly the same way. And all of us are trying to push to influence policy. And, you know, journal articles are one thing we have to do, but like most of us are actively trying to engage with policymakers, including myself.
Of course.
And it was really nice to see David Held quoted in your book. He's a political theorist who actually was my PhD examiner.
No way. Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah.
So that was cool to see a political theorist shout out. Yeah. So
no, because this is a subject of our time now. You know, it really is. And the sooner we act on it, the less of a sort of like emergency situation. What we don't want is for nobody to act on it for years and years, as has happened with the climate crisis, and then suddenly in a panic everyone sort of say, oh, we need a climate scientist, we need a political theorist to tell us, you know, what. I mean, it's too late then, so let's start talking about it now.
Well, I think your book will definitely be a huge part of opening that meaningful conversation. So I wanted to ask you something about migration. You paint this beautiful picture of migration as part of our history, which I've already touched on, but it really is woven in so well into the story of the book. But I also wanted to mention, you know, the kind of ancient cultural heritage sites or burial grounds that Indigenous populations in particular could be quite attached to, and rightfully so. So I'm wondering how we could navigate those issues as an international community, because although you paint a really positive picture, which I agree with, that it could be really great for humanity to have these kind of streams of migration to protect people from unlivable, uninhabitable zones, and it could benefit future cities that could be created, you know, in the northern latitudes. But I'm wondering about how to navigate the real loss of a homeland, especially for Indigenous populations who might not understand what's actually happening.
Yeah. So, you know, this migration, I believe, is anyway a positive thing. And I think more of us should move around because we could all benefit from that.
Yeah.
But the idea that enormous numbers of people will be forced by climate change, by an unlivable climate, to move away from hugely important cultural sites, cities, civilizations that have existed for thousands of years. There's no nice way of coating that. It's an absolute tragedy. And it's appalling that this will happen. I'm trying to be pragmatic about it because, you know, it is a disaster. And this is my way forward through it. But yes, you know, it is appalling, and there will be enormous losses to be had. Landscapes that people love and that are beautiful, climates that are being lost. I mean, I'm heartbroken about the loss of coral reefs, which are really, really, apart from their enormous biological and ecological importance, are the most beautiful landscapes on earth. I mean, they really are. They're just wonderlands. And I'm heartbroken that, for example, my children will never see the coral reefs that I swam in as a child because they just don't exist anymore. You know, coral reefs still exist sort of in a way, but they not that richness, not that beauty. But we're not only losing that, we're going to be losing, unfortunately, languages. We're losing languages at the fastest rate at the moment anyway. We're going to lose sites of significance and importance to all sorts of different cultures. Forests, you know, the losses are unbearable for our species because we do have this very rich cultural diversity. You know, the ways that we can make that loss more endurable are through acknowledging that and honouring different cultural practices in different locations. You know, I mean, the safety of human beings comes first, but you know, our cultural artifacts and places of importance and so on are part of what makes us human and makes, you know, gives our lives meaning. And anything we can do in new locations to honor that, you know, and to allow people to mourn what is lost, and to develop new rituals and new ways of making their cultural practices relevant to a different location.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that people of long ago Irish descent practice, you know, have St. Patrick's Day in New York, for example, is just one, you know, is one way that has been brought over. But every migrant community will have something, will have a special meal that they have, or a special picture in their house or icon that they worship, or something that ties them back to a different place, a different time. Even if they are no longer completely aware of its meaning, it still has meaning to that community. And these things are really important, will become increasingly important as people become dislocated.
I agree.
But something that's really, really, really important, I really wanted to make clear in this book, is if we do manage this, this transition in as positive a way possible, it comes at the same time as a massive restoration program that I think we need to start right away, which is to bring back the livability of our planet, to make it possible for communities and people to return to some of these places, to bring back the livability, perhaps as soon as the end of the century. You know, if this becomes a temporary managed transition over the next few decades, then we will have done a good job. And I hope that's possible.
Yeah, and it's the final chapter of your book that digs into that restoration and how that might work. So that's what I was reading last night on an airplane, which seems very, very fitting. Yeah, I agree. And you know, I'm a migrant from Austria. I live in the UK, and I have a child who I try to show, you know, some things from Austria, and you know, little rituals and things that I want her to learn. So I completely agree with you. And I remember at my school, for example, where we had 50 or 60 nationalities, we would have this like United Nations Day where everyone could dress in national dress and talk about their heritage. And I think obviously that's a bunch of children playing dressing up, but it is an example.
It's really important. It's really important because it says, you know, we know that you have things that are important in your home and your family and your community. And we value that, and we want you to share that with the rest of us, so that we, you know, can show our appreciation of this diversity. And I think that's really important. Just little rituals like that are really important.
Yeah, and it was always a wonderful day. You know, it came with the parents cooking different foods from their country.
Well, that's the best thing, I think, about cultural diversity.
It was really great. You know, I was a little kid eating all these wonderful dishes from around the world. So very lucky to have grown up like that. So there's just a couple more questions I wanted to ask you. And that's about your imagination for the future, because it comes across so beautifully in the book, but I wanted to give like people a preview of how you see the future. So I have two questions. One is, how would you describe the city of the future? So let's say like late century, and then the human of the future, who might they be? So if you could reflect on those questions to kind of wrap things up. So the city of the future.
Yeah. So the city of the future is, of the next few decades, is going to be in the northern latitudes. So it might be in Canada or Scotland, let's say Scotland. It's a dense city. So it's not built for cars, for suburbs. It's not built for that, because they will not be necessary in our new cities. It will be high, compared to some of the very low-rise European cities we're used to, which are just a couple of stories high. But it won't be a high-rise in comparison necessarily to a lot of the Asian cities we're used to, which are 20 even higher stories. So it'll be perhaps about 4 to 6 stories high, clusters of housing interspersed with many other activities, from shops to industry to everything, all zoned together. So everywhere is walkable. You can get to anywhere you need to get to, walking or on a cycle rickshaw, electric cycle rickshaw if you're disabled. It will have canopies over the streets to shade from the sun, and these canopies might be vegetation based, so also keeping the streets cool like that. It will also have excellent drainage, because flash floods will be a much stronger reality. So we're thinking places in northern latitudes will experience that sort of that monsoon rain, sudden heavy rains, and large periods of hot sunshine as well. The buildings of the future will create their own energy, will manage their own waste and water recycling systems. So they will not be net absorbers of energy as they are at the moment, and producers of large amounts of waste. There'll be a lot more water around to keep the system cool and to drain away flash floods and to store water. We will be eating different foods. It will be almost entirely meat-free in the future. So the proteins we get will be either plant-based or come from insects or algae, fungi, some bacterial proteins as well. But largely plant-based. We will be traveling to different cities using mainly electric transport. Our energy will be produced largely through renewables, but also through nuclear, and I hope fusion, but that's still uncertain. And the people of the future will have been born. Some will have been born in these new cities or expanded cities, and some will have been born, but the majority will have been born elsewhere. So these cities are largely migrant cities, either from other places within the same nation or continent, or from all around the world. And there will be a lot more, because of the challenges involved in incorporating an enormous number of migrants, which may swamp the original sort of native population. There will be a lot more programs of community building. So I guess social activities such as reforesting, rewilding, managing natural areas, taking part in care activities, social activities such as helping with language classes, helping with people with disabilities in certain areas, helping to create the infrastructure of these new cities. And these will be done in ways that enhance inclusion and promote a more holistic idea of what pride in one's land and nation is about, which is this bigger idea of a clean, healthy earth. Essentially, that's my dream.
I mean, that's a beautiful vision. And I could just kind of feel what it might be like to be there. You know, I'm imagining like lovely vegetation above my head, eating some interesting food, meeting my daughter's friends from all over the world, things like that. So it sounds beautiful. So I think we should definitely end on that note. I wanted to thank you for having this conversation with me today, and for having a chat about your amazing book. So I just want to remind the audience that Nomad Century, How to Survive the Climate Upheaval is out now, and there is a link below if you would like to purchase it.
Thanks so much, Alex. I really appreciate it.